So we're now moving on to our memorial landscapes, aspirations and designs, or maybe I should say actually designs and aspirations, because we're going to do it that way round session for this afternoon. And after that we'll be doing the breakout sessions, but I'll tell you a little bit more about them when we get there. So in this next session, we're looking at design and aspirations for Bunurong Memorial Park. And we'll be hearing from landscape architects Kirsten Bauer and Erwin Taal from Aspect. And they're going to talk about the design and how they tackled the unique brief for creating an inclusive space to meet cultural, spiritual and future needs for the Victorian community. We'll also be hearing from Nicholas Beck, SMCT's Head of Property, Infrastructure and Facilities, and he'll be discussing SMCT's aspirations for the cemetery into the future. But first, I would like to introduce Kirsten and Erwin. Kirsten is the Global Design Director for Aspect Studios. She's led significant award-winning projects across Australia and internationally, such as the Green Line, Paran Square, and the Caulfield to Dandenong level crossing removal project and Linear Park, and the new student precinct at Melbourne University. If you haven't seen any of those projects, they're really worth a visit. There were also tons more projects in Kirsten's bio, but I had to cut them down. Kirsten was an inaugural member of the Bunurong Council, which is also a really incredible council, which, I don't want to say governs the river, but is stewardship. It is tasked with the stewardship of the Bunurong, which really I think looks at the river in a really different way. And there's been some panels for Design Week on that, and there'll be an upcoming exhibition, so that'll be worth a look. Erwin Taal is a studio leader and senior associate at Aspect. He's over 20 years of professional experience in urban, regional and natural environments. His project experience ranges from large-scale infrastructure planning and urban design guidelines to green infrastructure and living architecture to small architectural installations within urban settings, so the very large and the very small. A core tenet of his work includes place creation and sustainable outcomes. Welcome, Kirsten and Erwin. Okay, it's just that one. All right.
Okay. There we go. So we thought it would be good to go back a time, and we were involved in this project, I think, more than 10 years ago when this project started. And this was primarily Aspect Studios in BBN, who were the architects. We sort of integrated and became the team to develop this park. So this Memorial Park has always been here for I don't know for how long. I'm looking at Nicholas and the other team. And what happened was they did a master plan, and then they decided that they wanted to try something different. And I think, we'll unpack what we mean by different. And so they went out for a tender process to look at what, in a sense, was restructuring and redesigning and adding new additions, pretty much this area that you see in front of you in the glass area. And here's were some of the words that they came up with, and it really was what they talked about, demystifying and redefining the cemetery. And they wanted to be an industry leader, and they still are an industry leader. So demystify the cemetery for the public so that they can have more reasons to visit, select and purchase, and affirmation of memory. So that was sort of like one of the statements that were provided in the brief for the project. And I suppose we took on that kind of quite literally, in terms of we went in there and actually ran a whole series of workshops where we sort of started from scratch in terms of what could a cemetery for the future actually look like and what should it contain, rather in a sense of taking, I suppose, the componentry of the sort of more traditional cemetery. In a sense, we were kind of like re-establishing what the brief might be. And obviously we were, SMCT were really, in a sense, quite up for that, in many ways. They were really they had very big ideas, and really they were looking for a way to actually demonstrate those ideas and sort of the physicality of a cemetery. And I haven't got my glasses, so there we go. So, and this is what we did when we came out of the workshops, is what would this look like? And of course it had to be sustainable, beautiful and iconic. I think that was pretty important. It had to demystify, so then we had to work out what does that actually mean. One of the core sort of tenets of this place is contemporary and distinctly Australian. Now, if you've gone to many cemeteries around Melbourne, they're not really distinctly Australian. They have very much a European type flavour. And so, again, we'll have to unpack what did that mean for this particular, sort of place, really. It had to be best practice in cemetery development, so that's what we also use. Very inclusive of everyone, which again was a shift. Now all these cemeteries are doing this, but this was 10 years ago when these kind of words weren't necessarily bandied around so much. And obviously to honour and celebrate life. And in many ways that was took to this location that you're sitting in today, which was designed to be more than a ceremonial place for life and death, for weddings, ceremonies or anything, in a sense. So this is a designed community facility. It doesn't have, in a sense, a faith structure to it. It doesn't have a memorialisation structure to it. It can be something utilised for the community across many different events, like today. Like, we're really quite comfortable being here. It's a fantastic place to be. And it doesn't have those traditional attributes, so to speak. And so Amy touched on it before in terms of, so we also did look backwards, like to determine what we mean by demystify a cemetery. And so this is a diagram from somebody, some person, where it kind of puts you where we are. Many of you might be aware of this, but, a lawn park cemetery is quite traditional. And in a sense, this evolution from the traditional down to Memorial Park, and where we're then saying, well, the Bunurong Memorial Park is something even more than that. And it's quite unique as well, is because as we know, land values are so important here. That's why the cemetery is here in a green wedge, literally on the edge of the city. Because this is of lower land value, and so you actually are required for a larger cemetery. So most of the new cemeteries that you'll be seeing going up around are really on the periphery of Melbourne now, and that's because of basically land value. But it's also an opportunity to try something different because you're less constrained, I suppose, in many ways. So this is just some of the traditional types of, we call them products. Sorry about our language, but when you're in this environment, you're designing a big idea, but at the same time, what you start to learn is you also have to look at the small things, like you're designing from the micro up to the macro. So you have to actually understand a body, the way the body sits in the ground or in a grave, and how that, in a sense, transforms a cemetery design, as much as it is about a spiritual or a faith or an emotional connection to the landscape. It's also about the pragmatics of literally a body in a zone. So you're working between what I always say, the sort of profound and the pragmatic. You're tied between these two issues all the time, and it's how they interweave with each other is where the kind of, I suppose, the design challenge comes about. So you've got the monument, and when we go on the tour, we'll kind of point them out. You're above ground, you actually are in a monument. A garden burial or a lawn burial where you actually are in lawn with a headstone, and these kind of more traditional types of products. And this is just sort of one idea that we came up with, as in we'll go from a botanical to an Australian garden. And this came from SMCT's sort of big showcase cemetery, I suppose, is Springvale. If you go there, it's got an incredible rose collection. Has anyone seen their rose collection? And it's incredibly, pretty amazing sort of thing. And part of that idea was kind of like, well, people want to be memorialised through plants. It's a very strong, powerful connection that people have. And there it was through roses. And so part of this idea was, how do you translate that to an Australian horticultural environment? And I don't know yet if this has really succeeded or not, but it was like trying to, how do you shift that to, being, wanting to be on a sort of a pruned banksia, for example. That would be instead of a rose tree. So there's a great little example out there about, are we as a society, able to see that as a memorialisation rather than to see a rose, you know what I mean? And I think we're in a society where we see both, you know what I mean? But what we're trying to do is go, in a sense, offer the Australian public a different way of thinking about it, because it hasn't really been done before. And also they were really, really important, particularly about this particular location, is because you don't have an immediate residential community. They can't just come next door and walk their dog over. You're in a community here that's a bit more distant. So I think we really had to work hard to say, if we want to bring the community here, because that's how you demystify a cemetery. You have to provide things here that people want to come to, and design it in such a way that they feel welcome when they come here. So it's something more of a daily activity rather than, as we've been talking about before, a once a year or ceremonial activity. So thinking about the community events and how that might work, such as weddings and things. Then the products, and I suppose this is what I mean by the you have to work from the micro, I suppose, and it's understanding all the different ways that people are buried, cremated, memorialised across the different faith, religions, cultural groups, and those kinds of things. And so the typologies of products is quite complex. And if you work with the cemeteries group, it really becomes, unfortunately, the word I always use, it's like a real estate game. It is actually understanding where the world is going. This particular group is more, wants this more type of product, so we're going to have to enlarge the area for that type of product. This product's not going so well, so we're going, So you actually have to move with the market, which sounds really crass, but it is actually a way of saying you're actually following the community, or you're reflecting. You have to be reflective of and responsive to the way the community is moving, And so that's part of, in a sense, both, I suppose, accepting traditional burial practices, but also inventing or looking at new ways, which many other people will be talking about, how other ways can people be memorialised. So I think they're pretty right saying the symbols of death say what life and those in life define what death must be. That's quite profound. Erwin, just throwing you in there now.
No worries. Look, Kirsten's already touched on this briefly, but there are a lot of different types of product that we then engage with. Traditional being the monumental, and like she mentioned, we will pass some of these more traditional areas. And
that's over there. There's some sections of that. We've got on the slide.
Another traditional one is, again, the lawn beam. But partly what we did is we also then explored what the lawn beam could also be. And another part that we'll come across will show a slightly different version of the lawn beam. There's a little sketch in the bottom right corner. But it's more than about taking the basic idea of having a body with a plaque in an open space and then changing it, making it a little bit more special or a little bit more intimate and individual. And I think Kirsten did sort of touch on this briefly, but part of the reason why we're exploring this is because every single thing within this cemetery has a dollar value. And we'll get to that later on. The memorialisation is, I think, one of the interesting things that we were challenged with on this one. We do have a lot of traditional ways of memorialising. It's the plaque and the rock, it's the bench in the open space. But then we sort of also, again, challenged that to sort of see how we could do these in different ways, how we could really start thinking about building it into the infrastructure or building it into the elements you see around. The bridge over the over the lake being one of the cases, where that came from a pragmatic approach that the client was concerned about ashes being thrown into the water and creating algae blooms. So we then sort of said, well, what if we didn't do that? But what if we found a way to memorialise close to the water so that you could then effectively have that same experience about casting into water or that engagement with water, which again is a very fundamental thing about a lot of people's belief in sort of the afterlife, but do it in a meaningful way. And so when you walk across the bridge, take a look at the handrails carefully. There's actually all plaques in there, and there'll be canisters hidden underneath those plaques. But again, incorporating that into what we would consider the everyday infrastructure in a beautiful way is also part of what we then sort of came through with this process. I've got a jam.
Nope.
There we go.
Sorry for this.
Kirsten's touched on the basic rules, and again, this was one thing that we really thought we needed to get to understand to then build it back into everything. And we really started getting a little bit blasé about jokes about death, about the words that you'd throw around that normally you feel there's a degree of sacrilege around it, but the more you kind of remove the emotions away, the more you do realise that this is all about how you can create value, because again, everything here will be sold, everything has a dollar price, but how you can then sort of make it beautiful and effectively inflate the value of things.
maybe not the wording
No,
flame,
but allow a higher value to be attributed towards an element.
Yeah, and that came really from that. We talked before that, you know, the most efficient use of space is like the top diagram. That is the most efficient use of space, is really, and what we're trying to go is, how can we tweak that so you get more landscape, more experience and more amenity into those spaces? And that's not just about the value of that, it's also wanting, I think what we learned from the community and from a lot of members was, community was, people want to come here and feel like they're part of a parkland. You know, not feel like they're actually immersed in a very rigid cemetery environment, and actually achieving the balance. Like, this is all about achieving the balance between it being a sustainable parkland as well as being an operational and sufficient, you know, self-funded, sufficient cemetery system. And that's where they were talking before about the balance. I think that Damien was talking about that as well. You know, and that's the constant trick, is how you find that right balance between those very competing issues. And these are just, different types
of studies that we undertook.
Yeah.
So I think onto Bunurong itself. From the outset, the idea that Aspect and BVN had was that for the main area, sort of up around where all the chapels and the other facilities are, is we wanted to have a singular entry point for everybody. So that, the reason why we do that is to effectively democratise this idea that everyone leaves their lives behind, they come through a threshold, and they come into the centre of this beautiful place. And so that is the start of the whole process and the whole change in psychology, that you are now within a space for a different purpose.
Because traditionally, and this happens here as well, you drive in and you look at the map and you drive towards the grave. So it's very much a car-based system. Most of the cemeteries are very car-based, especially the larger ones. So this is also trying to reduce that car-based thing and saying, maybe park at the beginning, enter collectively, and then, yes, you may have to drive if you're a few hundred metres away, but it was also trying to change the way people would actually move through the cemetery.
So we applied that to the initial master plan. Now, we realised that the initial master plan had some good bones about it. The layout did sort of make a lot of sense. The lake was here already, and we were then, and already there's a whole sort of section near the road, out in that sort of corner over there behind my shoulder, that was already established. So that how we could then work within that and try and transform it to address a lot of the principles that we were putting forward. We were really just looking at stage one, which was the central community area, or the civic sort of area, and then the very large mound that you drive past on the way through. The mound in many ways was born out of a lot of responses to the environment. It is pretty windy down here at times. Some of the adjacent properties you don't really want to have as part of your visual experience.
It's a visual buffer kind of process, of screening out what's beyond that area and mounting that up. Yeah.
And so we thought, and the added benefit of that is that you can then start getting, skip through this one. The central precinct, sort of the main areas of monumental lawn and the rooms, and these were all designed in a way that they could be flexible. We would provide the infrastructure around it, how you would access it, how you would enter it, but then there was the ability to sort of change the rooms within these spaces depending on the need of the community, as Kirsten pointed out before. But another key driver that we came up with, a key benefit of having the mound, is, again, it is a real estate exercise. A water view is a more desirable thing than a view of your neighbouring industrial estate. So that the more we could then try and focus the attention on Peace Lake here, the more we could then increase the value of the land that we were delivering here for SMCT. Another benefit was because the water table under here is relatively close to the ground. In a lot of places we can't do more than one person deep, according to all the depths we've got. In this build-up mound area, we can go to 3 deep. So again, there's another way of adding value and embedding that within an element. So I think there's a lot of these little sort of things that we worked through, and it was great to sort of have SMCT on board, who were really engaging in this process and really sort of understood where we were coming from. So we then came up with a whole product distribution map, and again this was tested through the marketing and through the product teams within SMCT, and again really sort of trying to identify where the larger areas were that could become your more traditional lawn beams or your monumental areas, but where could we then start introducing other elements or other products? And going back to the slide previously, we identified that within the centre of the stage one where all the chapels were, there was a great opportunity to memorialise, which again would start sort of introducing elements that were different to what would be anywhere else. We should do the bridge as a red zone as well, but they then gave us the opportunity to start playing around with different ways of finding a way that we could attribute that memorialisation to each element. Community precinct, I'll just skip through this. We'll walk through here, so that sort of makes more sense.
One thing though is I think that the fundamental difference between this precinct and probably most other cemeteries I've seen in Australia, and it's something that's been done in some of the sort of overseas one, is did anyone come through the entrance this morning? Yeah. Did you notice that it was just one sort of single entry? So the idea, it'd be interesting to see your experience it if it works, is this sense of because we went through all these different studies, do you put the car park over there, how does it work? So the idea was you come, you drop the car park, you kind of leave that life behind. So it is a sort of a threshold process. You leave the cars behind, you move up through the entry, it's a single entry, so everyone's coming together, as Erwin's saying, it's this sort of democratisation, everyone coming together. You have the memorial wall, so you're not quite yet seeing the entire landscape. So it's about, some people might say maybe this is different, but it's about centering yourself, it's about bringing it down to a certain scale. So, and it's also about leaving, that world behind in some regards. And then you walk through and then it opens up into a beautiful garden. That kind of sort of series of thresholds is something that we try to really build up through that whole area. And then also there was this issue of, well, some people want to go to the ceremonies and to the funerals, and some people might just want to have a cup of coffee. So it was allowing, you could have the deeply kind of ceremonial activities to occur next to the everyday activities of going and having a coffee or visiting the florist. So in a sense, it allows both activities to occur without, in a sense, being on top of each other. And that's what we'll constantly try to do all the way through to balance those different daily activities and the more ceremonial activities.
And I think a big part of that was also to really start welcoming the community in, so that you could come here for a cup of coffee with your mother's group or whatever you sort of come here for, and then not have to feel like you were coming into a cemetery and not having to be confronted by a funeral right around the corner type.
Yeah. And of course they interact. This is not about removing the interaction, it's about curating that interaction, or at least leaving space for people to technically avoid or want to embrace, whichever way you go. So, and one thing we've learnt a lot about cemeteries, it's fundamentally about the cemetery. They always talk about it, as soon as you get out of the car, you are on that journey between you and the grave, or you and the funeral process, or you in a celebration. So every part has to be curated and thought through. And it's not just how you move through that space, it's about how the deceased moves through that space and the funeral services move through that space. It's also about how the administrators and the people who work in here move through that space. So everyone's got a slightly different way of moving. And you're trying to, in a sense, orchestrate that so you're not running into the wrong things at the wrong time, if I can put it that way. So it is very highly sort of coordinated is the word.
And I think the challenge for us is often there'll be a front of house experience and a back of house experience. Yeah. But we didn't really have the luxury of having a separate back of house experience where that's just the space where people are running around just doing everything in the background. Because for some people, the back of house space is actually their front of house experience. This is for the funeral directors. They also need to have a very logical way of moving through the space. In many ways, it almost becomes like an airport in that way, in that sense. And again, we do throw around a lot of interesting analogies about this and jokes about death.
Because sometimes you're dealing with 500 people who are over there, and you've got to get those 500 people across to the function centre, and then they're not going to run into another funeral which is exiting the function centre at the same time. So that's it's really quite an activity, and it has its impact spatially. So when you go there and have a look, they're all located for a reason. It's not some sort of random thing. And the chapels was a really big thing in terms of, well, we call them chapels, but they're not called chapels today. That's correct, isn't it? They're not called chapels, are they? They're called, they've got names. Each of them, ceremony, yeah, and each of them got a name, because that's a big shift that most cemeteries have done now. That, that word of the chapel and all of that has moved away, and now it's a ceremonial space. And they're non-religious, but you can easily put all the religious treatments and items like that can be transferred into each space, and that allows that flexibility. And it's very much about these are all sort of the renders we did. You know, it's also about bringing lighting. Like many people think of, these spaces as quite dark. I think fundamentally here it was all about light. You know, access to light, visibility of light, access to the landscape. So it was really shifting that relationship around. And this is the function centre, and if you go there today, it's not dissimilar. And then there's the water feature along the side, which in a sense became quite it's a memorialisation feature, but it's also about sound as well. Like a lot of the areas is about bringing water into it to, in a sense, to I suppose be part of that other level of we call it sort of
experience.
Yeah, and it's sort of when you have lots of people around, it's another way of sort of dampening the sound in certain directions and things like that. But also, as we know, water, as you said, it's a fundamental aspect of life, and so it is a very an important component of these spaces.
And I think especially just on the point about water, we did really think a lot about it. So it's not just the view to the water, but it's your experience with it. And so there's a whole water story starting from the entry, the fountain at the start to help dampen the water wall, the moving in through the series of connected ponds, if you want to call them, through the function centre. As you walk around, just sort of at the end of the bridge, there's a gentle sort of cascade or ripple of the water sort of flowing towards the lake, and then beyond the lake.
And then one of the big shifts here, I think, that now everyone's doing, but at that time it was quite interesting, was the multi-faith centre or the, sorry, I'll put the name now. I don't remember to the SMCT people, what's it called now? Oh, the multi-faith centre. It's got the name of it now. It's terrible, isn't it? But that was really where you could go and pray, or you could meditate or contemplate. And it's like what you were saying this morning about the miscarriage memorial. It was like what they realised is there was people coming to breathe and wanted to undertake certain ceremonies and things like that. But in a sense, it was quite private. It was very contemplative and very intimate. And so you have these massive gathering spaces, but this was providing very specialised sort of intimate spaces. So if you have an opportunity to go there, do it respectfully. But that was kind of like the start of that sensibility of understanding that there is diversity in our community and we need to incorporate that in our cemeteries. Final plan, or roundabout, it kept changing a bit. And then we also developed a flower garden, an Australian garden, a celebration of colour and light as part of that relationship. And these are just some other images of trying to bring an Australian aesthetic there. So like avenues are obviously Australian trees. They're not always that perfectly straight, that's a render. But it's good to go out there now and see how they're developing. And that's a classic technique, really now everywhere is you create, as Erwin's saying, you create these rooms, you're surrounded by vegetation, and then you bring the product within those rooms. And that, because you don't want to be, I always say, I know it's very flippant, but you don't really want to be buried amongst 500 people, but you want to feel like you're in a village. It's kind of like a village mentality. You want to be in a space where you feel like you're part of a community. If it's too vast, you lose that sense of community. And so you're trying to find the right spatial scale that makes you feel like you're part of something, and that's where the rooms come in and that's how they work. And then, of course, the ceremonial bridge system to here, the sanctuary, which has been great. That was quite unique, and it'll be interesting to hear from Nicholas and others how successful that's been, because that was quite a different thing to do. It was quite out there. So there's a few experiments that we've done. We're very honest. There was a lot of experimentation going on. Some of it worked, some of it didn't work. And still that's occurring. I'll just play the video because we're probably over time now. Yeah. See if that works. This is something we did earlier on to sort of explain the concept. So that's what it was like before. You can start to see that's the existing part of the development, stage 1 boundary, the park being developed. New rooms. And they've been developed now. When we go out there later, you'll see that there's a new scatter garden that's been in there for a couple of years as well, and a rock garden that we did with, if I get the name right, Philip Johnson, rock man. Johnson Garden. Yeah, we got him to come over and help us do a sort of a rock garden as well. And we were trying to experiment with more Australian materialities, big rocks and things like that, rather than the more Gentile sort of European forms. Here's the lake. Bridge. And strange enough, one of the biggest issues here is the wind, as Erwin described, and that's still, there was a lot of discussions about wind. Yeah.
I think especially because when we first came to the project, a lot of the trees you see, especially on that side of the view, they weren't here. So that we deliberately planted a whole lot of windbreaks. Again, a cultural landscape reference, but also something to start breaking down the vast sort of land here into the smaller zones.
And yes, there are barbecues. That was part of it, was putting a couple of barbecues in and trying to provide those facilities for just everyday use, really. Yeah. The different areas. And we did a coastal garden. We can go and have a look at that as well. Anyway, that's just...
I think that the coastal garden is just a deliberate connection to or reference to the landscape of the Mornington Peninsula. So that this being one of the closest cemeteries near the peninsula, it is sort of a large proportion of the people who come here. So to provide something that allows that direct connection was also a deliberate sort of choice.
Just like that. There we are. So that's before, and that's what it's like now. So, we held off showing you lots of photos of what it looks like now because we thought that would be part of the tour when we go and visit all those different spaces and give you more of a detailed story about those places. Yeah.
Thanks, Erwin and Kirsten. I think, as you can see from the programming today, cemeteries are really complicated, and I think the mix of kind of understanding the financial reality but also understanding the kind of community benefit is really, really fascinating. I'm just going to flick through a few of these things, which some of you will see. You can all have a wander around as well, even if you're not on the tour. You'll be able to see some of these beautiful spaces. Obviously, that's the one we're in now. So many slides. And now we're just going to have a chat with Nick. Nick is the Head of Properties, Infrastructure and Facilities at the Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust, and basically his portfolio is responsible for the buying, planning, building and maintenance of SMCT's current and future cemeteries. And he's going to chat to us a little bit about what the aspirations or the future aspirations for Bunurong Memorial Park are. Welcome, Nick.
Okay, good afternoon. Probably in the interest of time, I'll speed through some of the sort of, less relevant stuff. And I think from listening to the earlier presentation, the actual master planning is probably of most interest. I'll skip through to the master plan and get started. But essentially, that concept of real estate and how we use our spaces is really interesting, and it's something that we spend a lot of time considering. This master plan is one that we're in the process of developing, so this hasn't actually been finalised yet. Start of this financial year, so 1st of July, we sort of embarked on creating a master plan for all 9 of our cemeteries. Now, 7 of our cemeteries are actually at capacity, so there's not a huge amount of influence or changes we can make to those spaces, but there is still some other concepts that we can consider, such as passive open space, and we've spoken about that before, about utilisation and how these spaces are best used. In terms of this image here, though, it's really a carry-on from Aspect's original master plan that you saw earlier in the presentation, which was really about the front half, or the, I guess you would call that the eastern side of the cemetery. We're now into a position where we're starting to look at developing the rest of the cemetery and starting to forecast end dates of when we'll actually have completely filled this cemetery. And it's an interesting concept when you think about filling cemeteries and getting to the end of where there is no more land to develop. Of particular note that I thought I would point out in this master plan is the wetlands. And the wetlands is really, again, something to consider with, more consciousness than normal, in terms of it has a value. The closer you are, like anywhere, closer you are to water, generally the higher the value of that land. But the wetlands also have an infrastructure element to it as well. You can see Wetland 2, Wetland 1 and Catchment Dam. They actually all feed into the existing dam network here, and we filter the water and then actually use it to irrigate the entire cemetery. Other things that are of note, we've got all those colours that you can see are projects for the next 5 years. You can see how quickly we do take up, or we do consume, or the demand consumes the cemetery. The white roads to the sort of southwest there is what we're forecasting for the next sort of 15 to 20 years. So at the moment, based on our current uptake or sales, we are projecting about 2040 will be the last year where we'll have available stock at Bunurong, which is considerably sooner than we had expected only 10 years ago. In terms of interesting projects that we have here, and I'm going to talk to it in a second about the community pavilion, you can only just quite see it right at the top there. It's got a red dot, or number 31. I probably should have put a circle or something around it. But the community pavilion, I'll jump straight into that. Community pavilion is a really interesting project. Both Kirsten and Erwin touched on the wind aspect at Bunurong, and it is something that we really need to be conscious of when designing our spaces, and also designing spaces like the community pavilion, in that it is has elements of windbreak associated with it, but it's also quite practical. In terms of the space, though, we have designed it to be inclusive. But of particular note, I've put there is it's the pink arrow pointing to both the plan and the concept sketch. This is an area I've had to educate myself and the rest of the team is, it's called a wudu or ablution, which is a space for people of Islamic faith to clean their hands and feet before prayer. It's a really important aspect to include in our future design. A lot of the sort of northern boundary of Bunurong is in Islamic graves. As part of that, this actual community pavilion or the abolition or the wudu is not to do with the actual burial, but it's to do with the people that are using our cemetery. They come in to grieve and remember their loved ones, but they also pray 5 times a day, which means that they need to have these spaces available to them that are in close proximity to where they would be grieving or where they would be visiting. But at the same time, it is a community space. There's lots of different, it's a multi-faith cemetery where there's lots of different spaces and lots of different communities that use it. So the idea of designing this was to, one, provide the services and infrastructure that our users or customers or community need, but also provide it in a way that's not exclusionary to any other groups. So as part of this, we've got the central gathering space in the middle there, and the ablution or wudu is right down the bottom, and it is actually, the way we've designed it in incorporating the windbreaks is also to provide a sense of privacy to the people that are using those spaces. One of the interesting parts that we've included in here is into the engraving or the tiles. We've actually put in, it's called a, get this name right, a Mecca marker. And it actually points directly to Mecca so that when people are praying, they know exactly which way to set up their prayer mats. We've also tiled this entire space in a way that there is no harsh surfaces or ends. It's tiled right up to the walls so that if someone were praying without shoes, without anything on, that there's low risk of injury, which is a really important aspect when designing a space like this. The last one here, I've got the mobile food truck. Now, it's kind of stolen a bit of my thunder when everyone saw it out the front before, but I didn't actually expect that to be there. So, look, I put it in there anyway. It's a really interesting one that it's only about 9 months old. We've only just got it recently. We're really in the market testing phase at the moment, but the idea of the food truck, or the mobile food catering van, as we so affectionately call it, was about activating spaces. The idea that at both Springvale and Bunurong, we already have a cafe, but they're right at the front of our cemeteries. People don't typically always stop right at the front, go in, get a coffee and go out and visit their loved one's memorial. The idea of this is that we can actually take it out and it can be a mobile cafe, especially on busy days like Mother's Day, Father's Day, Easter, where we have extremely high visitation. This can help with traffic management and moving people away from the epicentre of our cemeteries. But also in this photo, as you can see, we've actually used it to activate entirely new spaces within the cemetery that once we couldn't. So a good example of this one is the Garden of No Distant Place at Springvale. It's an absolutely amazing garden. It was built in the 80s, but we don't have any ability to really service a function or any sort of ceremony there. Now with the food truck, we're able to provide not only the catering but the infrastructure to be able to do that. The food truck comes with it. It's got a generator on the back and it makes us a lot more mobile. It really prolongs the public stay at our spaces as well, and it's quite engaging. At the moment, just trying to think of... and the actual mobile food catering van is available as part of our packaging. So if someone were to want to have a ceremony out in the grounds, they are actually able to hire this and our staff, and we can put on a service similar to this, which is, from what we understand, we're the first cemetery in Australia to trial something like this. And it really moves on with SMCT's perspective of innovation and trialling new things. And as Kirsten said, they don't always work. So far, in the first 9 months, the mobile food truck is really kicking goals. All right.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to kind of be taken behind the scenes, I think, a little bit of the cemetery. We're about to embark, or we're about to all kind of divide up and depart now for the next sessions. But while I've got you all here together, I'd really just want to thank all of our speakers from today, and also pre-thank our workshop and tour guides. So I'd love to thank Damien, Hayley, Melissa and Amy for our first session, Nicholas, Kirsten and Erwin for speaking about the cemetery, and pre-thank Kirsten, Erwin, Gillian West, Nina Thomas and Gina Kelly for our tours and workshops. I'd also like to remind you all that we've got another day of programming tomorrow at the NGV. You're welcome to come along. I think there's still some tickets left. And that our programming this weekend is presented by us, Open House Melbourne, in partnership with our major program partner, the Southern Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust. Thank you for hosting us today. And also we've got other program partners, Greater Metropolitan Cemeteries Trust, and also the Death Tech research team, who you'll see a bit more of tomorrow, in association with the University of Melbourne School of Computing, Information Systems and School of Culture and Communication. Sorry, there's lots of different faculties at Melbourne University. And also that this program is part of the Melbourne Design Week for 2024, the NGV's Melbourne Design Week. It's an initiative of the Victorian government in collaboration with the NGV. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our hosts one more time, SMCT, for this lovely day we've had so far, and the wonderful afternoon that we're going to have. Thank you.